Hi, I'm Arush, and this is the first video in a tutorial series where you learn the basics to making art. We'll start the series by talking about drawing, mainly with our pencil, as it's the easiest form. You can use a variety of different things to draw, such as pens, color pencils, charcoal pencils, and more. The tool is not really the most important, but it's how you're using the tool, and how you train yourself with the tool. So today we'll be focusing on some simple drawing techniques and concepts to help you get an idea of how to draw. So to start, let's talk about shading techniques. Shading can be defined as the darkening of an illustration to add depth or detail. Everyone has their own unique style of shading, and as you draw more and more, you develop your own sense of shading. The four most common forms of shading, and the ones we'll be discussing in this video, are hatching, scumbling or scribbling, stippling, and blending. So let's start off with the easiest form, blending. So blending, along with hatching, is the most commonly used form on this list. Involves using a gradient and going from dark to light or light to dark to simulate shadows and the effect of light. So I personally like starting from dark to light. It's more natural for me, but you can do it whichever way you like. So it looks something like this. You've probably seen it a lot before. So you start dark, gradually let go of the pressure on the pencil, and your line should get lighter. Now it won't be perfect the first time. Sometimes the gradient isn't as natural, so you just gotta go back over and reshade, just like that. So let's try this together in an example. Let's start with a simple cube. So I'll just use a lighter pencil. For this video, I'm using two types of pencils. You can use one if you want. I just have two. So this one is called an H pencil. It's just lighter than my other pencil. It's a pretty light pencil. And this one, my other pencil is a 4B. So if you have any light or dark pencils, I'd recommend you use those, but it doesn't really matter. If you have a dark pencil, just draw lighter. Don't use as much pressure when you draw. So we'll start with a simple cube. We'll just make it this way. Okay, there's our cube. So, before we start blending, we need to understand the effect of light. So, first we need to think about where this light is actually going to hit our cube. So, you can pick a light source anywhere, but for here, I'm going to pick a light source coming from the top left. So I'll just draw like a sun, pretend that's our light source, and it's striking down on this cube. So there's 4 or 5 types of shadows that you need to remember when you're making your art. The first one is the cast shadow, which is the actual shadow of the cube on the surface it's on. So let's say this cube is on a table. The shadow will fall on the table like that. That's just your simple cast shadow. The second type is your core shadow, and it's actually the darkest part of the cube which doesn't receive any light. So as this cube or this light source is shining this way, this side will be the darkest side of the cube and have the core shadow. The third shadow is called the reflected light, and it's the light that bounces off the surroundings back onto the cube, and it creates a subtle glow in normally dark areas. So you can imagine if this light bounces, gets past here, and if this is the surface, it'll bounce on this surface and back onto this really dark side. So somewhere in our core shadow, there'll be a small reflection, a small lighter area. And our fourth shadow is called the highlight shadow. Simply, it's just the brightest part of the cube that receives light directly. So the brightest part of the cube, here it's kind of neutral, but I'm going to pick the brightest part of the cube here to be this left side, because I think it's receiving the most light from where I've drawn the sun. Our last type of shadow is called a terminator line or a boundary shadow. It's basically a transition zone between your core shadow and your lighter shadows. So it's not as dark as the core shadow, but it's still clearly visible. So it's also sometimes on this cube, it'll be the side that's not directly receiving light, but also not completely receiving no light at all. So this top side, it is receiving light, but it's not going to be as dark as this core shadow. So, with all that in mind, let's start shading our cube. And we'll start from the darkest side, the core shadow. So I'm going to imagine first, just to make space for this, for the highlight, or the reflected light, I'm going to imagine there's a small side here that's a little lighter than the rest. So I'll start first by outlining my cube. This just makes the lines a little darker, so it's easier for me to stay inside and shade. So I'll just very lightly, I'll grab my darker pencil, and just darken these edges, because I'm going to use a Q-tip actually to blend, rather than my pencil. You can use a pencil if you want, or you can use your finger to actually blend, but I prefer to use a Q-tip, or you can use the edge of a paper. So I'm just going to very lightly come out like we did earlier, just lightly. Just like that. And now I'm going to grab my Q-tip right here, and you're just going to try and spread your shading all around this face of the cube, so your Q-tip will get darker. So you should probably have a couple Q-tips handy, because these Q-tips can get used up quickly sometimes. So we see how most of this cube is dark except a small portion on the bottom. I'm going to actually try to make that a little bit more visible, but there's a reflected light here. Let's smoothen that out. And that's what our core shadow looks like. So now I'm going to work on the next shadow, which is going to be, I'm going to work on the boundary shadow. So I'm just going to outline this cube again. I'll outline the entire thing this time. Okay, so the boundary shadow, it's going to be lighter than this. So I'm just going to lightly do that. Just very lightly trace those lines and just smudge, essentially. Now it's kind of hard to differentiate. Add a little bit, use an eraser to make it a little bit lighter. And we can make our core shadow a little bit darker then. Let's blend that in. It's much darker now. So now we can properly see the difference between the boundary shadow and the core shadow. There you go. And I'll just clean up the spot in the corner. Okay, so now we have our third type of shadow. We'll talk on the cube at least, is our highlight shadow, which will be our lightest portion. So you can choose to either not shade this at all, or just very lightly shade it. So I'm actually going to switch back to my lighter pencil, because I don't want to make it too dark, and just very lightly go back and forth and barely fill this section up. So that's what your cube looks like, with all the types of shadows on the cube. So our last type of shadow that's remaining is the cast shadow. So the cast shadow's length varies on where your light source is. Like in real life, if the sun is higher up, your shadow will be shorter usually. Or if the sun is lower down, your shadow will be much longer. So we can measure this approximately using a ruler. And essentially, we'll go from our light source to the cube and just draw a very light line pointing to the surface. So essentially looks like there, if that's our surface. And we'll do the same thing on this. So starting from there. So it'll be approximately about here, because it's falling in that direction. So now what you just want to do is I'm going to start from here, and I'm going to start the cast shadow is going to be the darkest nearest the cube and get lighter as you go out. So I'm just going to start pretty dark over here and just gradually get lighter as we did earlier. Now I'm just going to make the tip of my cast shadow a little shorter, just like that. Now you can blend it if you want. I think it looks decent as is, but I'm just going to lightly blend it to make it a little smoother. And that's basically how blending works. Our next shading technique is called hatching. Hatching is, as I mentioned above, the second most common form of sketching. So a lot of people try to hatch differently, but how I prefer to hatch is you want to start from wherever you're going to start your line, and you just want to, kind of like a blade of grass, you just want to make these light strokes and let go of your pencil at the end. You want your end to be pointy, like a blade of grass, and not stumpy. So you don't want it to look like that. You want it to look like that. And you can take your time with these. So just practice for a moment making this sort of pattern. So hatching can be used for a lot of things. It can sometimes just use to fill up empty space, but one of my favorite things to use it for is actually to show reflection in like hair or water. So for demonstration, let's just make a quick rectangle that we can shade inside. Okay, so you want to grab your darker pencil and go from one side and just hatch towards the middle. And take your time with this hatching. So just slowly hatch. They don't all have to be the same length. And now, once you hatch from one side, just hatch from the other. And your lines will overlap a little, that's okay. So now, let me just darken this boundary up here. You can kind of see the illusion of some sort of reflection in this portion between the two hatches that isn't shaded. There's some sort of reflection. So that's one of my favorite uses of hatching. There's two other types of hatching you can do. One is called cross hatching, where you hatch in one direction and then hatch in an opposite direction against that line, creating some sort of waffle effect. And the third type of hatching is called contour hatching. So essentially, you hatch in the contour of the object. So if my object here is a cylinder and it's curved, I'll hatch along the curve. It's a little bit more difficult because you've got to curve your hatch while still keeping it pointy. But that's what it looks like. Okay, so our third form is called scribbling, and it essentially it's much less technical than the last two, and it's a lot more fun also. Instead of going back and forth or hatching specifically, you just make scribbles in whatever fashion you want to make your scribbles. So I'll demonstrate using a cone, and let's just pretend our light source is up here. And we'll just quickly measure how far this is going to fall. So from the top, it falls about there. And from the bottom, starts at about here. So it'll be just about there. Okay, So now, before I start shading, I'm just going to outline my cone. Outlining before you shade is just generally good practice. So I'll just make random scribbles, starting dark from here, getting lighter as we get towards the surface that is getting hit directly from that light. And you can, of course, if you really want to, you can use a Q-tip again and just make your scribbling a little smoother. And for the shadow, you want to start darkest near the cone, and just get lighter and lighter as you go out. So that's kind of what scribbling looks like. So now, our last form of shading is called stippling. Now this is a form you won't usually see or use almost ever. I barely use it in any of my drawings, and it's because it's really complex and it takes a long time. It takes a lot of patience to make good drawings with stippling, but it is really unique compared to the other three we've done here. So it basically uses small dots to create your gradients. So the more dots that are concentrated in one area and the darker the dot, the darker that area will become. And when you ease up on your dots and space them out more, it'll create your lighter gradient. So I'll just do a small demonstration with a cube. Make a very light boundary. Not sure if you guys can see it on camera, but it's just a really light boundary. And we'll just pretend the light is coming from there, somewhere in the top right. And so this side will be the darkest. So you just want to be really patient with your dots and just make dots. This is why this technique takes so long, because just filling up even a small space can take forever. And that's what stippling looks like. So obviously this isn't the greatest example. I'll put an example up on screen. Stippling is a really hard concept to get down. But yeah, so those are your 4 types of the most common shading. And that's all for this video. You should practice your skills on some shapes like the cubes, cones, and even spheres. Spheres are a little harder because there's no really straight line, it's all a curve. And just practice on any real life still objects. I like to practice on a Rubik's Cube when I started. It was really fun for me. So just project a light from anywhere and try to use a mix of any of these techniques to create something. So next video, we'll use some of these shading techniques to create a final art piece. Thank you for watching.